One of the many cursed stories to come out of the second science shack is that of the detector from hell. My lab was contracted to build a detector for another government agency, and by my lab, I mean all of the adults in the lab collectively decided that it would be a great idea to give that task almost entirely to the youngest and dumbest person in the building, me. See if you can spot where things go wrong. Now, one of the other interns had already laid some of the groundwork for the detector by the time I was assigned to the project. By sitting in a pitch-black room for 8 hours a day like your average league ranked grinder, she had already determined which of the detector components worked best together and had gotten the relevant parts ordered for further testing. Now that she'd been relieved of her duty by finishing her internship, it was my turn. My first task would be to unload the components from the loading bay and to bring them up to our floor for cleaning and assembly. Unfortunately, the minimum order size from this company that we got the components for was 1,000 pounds worth of components. Even more unfortunately, the boss of the lab had assigned a pair of cripples to do the job. I had herniated my disc lifting a while back, and the postdoc who was lumped in with me also had a herniated disc, so there was little chance that we would be able to move this massive box without putting both of ourselves in the ER. Disregarding our concerns of grievous bodily harm, however, we moved on. To start off, we borrowed a pallet jack from the janitor's closet and managed to drag the massive crate into the freight elevator. Unfortunately, when we arrived at the correct floor, we discovered the hard way that it was much more difficult to push a pallet jack than to drag it. There was a tiny, maybe 2 centimeter gap between the floor of the freight elevator and the floor we were trying to get it up on, but moving half of a ton over 2 centimeters is a lot harder than you might think. I even tried pushing with my feet on the wall of the elevator, but it wasn't any use. We were thoroughly stuck, and to make matters worse, the elevator's alarm was starting to shriek in complaint that we'd kept the door open for too long. In a stroke of genius, the postdoc climbed over the crate and borrowed a second pallet jack. She then used this to jack up not only the box, but also the original pallet jack and get it both over the edge. With this 2-jack combination, we eventually managed to coax the crate into the hallway. This whole ordeal took more than an hour just to move the crate up a floor and out the elevator, but we had only just begun. Having extracted the crate from the elevator, it was now time to get the crate into the correct room. Unfortunately for us, the crate was about as wide as the hallway we wanted to get it into. And even more unfortunately, due to the way that we'd gotten the crate out of the elevator, there was almost no way for us to rotate the crate into the desired hallway without bumping into the walls with the pallet jacks. After some brainstorming, we came up with the idea that we'd unload part of the crate to lighten it enough that we could reposition the jacks underneath it. Now, as a physics major, you'd think that I'd be competent enough to know that unloading only one side of the crate was a bad idea, because then it wouldn't be balanced right. But need I remind you that I'm the kind of person to destroy my chair and my computer over something as trivial as calculus? Regardless, I learned the folly of my ways soon enough when the whole crate started to tilt and eventually fell off one of the pallet jacks we had it on with an ear-shatteringly loud clatter. It sounded like someone had set off an IED in a pottery shop, and when the thing fell and all of its contents came spilling out. This crash was loud enough that we actually attracted the attention of some construction workers who had been working on the other side of the building. They asked the very distraught 2 of us what was up and, after hearing our plight, decided to help us. There were no more pallet jacks left at this point, so the 4 of them found some steel bar that I think was originally part of a missile, jammed it under the fallen crate, and heaved on the bar until the crate eventually came back to rest on one of the jacks. But just as soon as our saviors had appeared, they vanished to respond to a higher calling, their lunch break. I suggested to the postdoc that we also go get lunch, but she wasn't having any of it. She pointed out that they had just fixed a problem that I'd caused, which was fair, so we got back to work. Now we were more than 2 hours in by the time we'd righted the crate, but it was now time to get it down the hall. The first problem was dealing with the entryway to this hall. There were 2 steel frames that jutted out from the sides of the hallway, presumably just to irritate people in my exact position. I ended up having to get power tools and remove these massive frames, at which point we were able to shuffle the crate to the other end of the hallway. Unfortunately, when we got there, we realized that it wasn't going to fit because there were these stupid steel frames again. I took these frames off at the other end of the hallway, but even then, it wasn't enough. The office of the building director was situated right where we needed to turn the crate around, and it turned out that his door handle was actually stopping our crate from being able to rotate around that corner. I told the postdoc about my intentions to go ask the big boss if I could remove his door handle, but she immediately shut it down with a glare that I could only describe as soul-piercing. Consequently, the big boss was left alone as we tried desperately to shimmy the crate around the corner. Using the same technique as we had at the elevator, we eventually managed to jam another jack underneath the first one and rotate the whole assembly around the corner, but not before causing enough noise that the big boss's secretary came out to see what was going on. RIP. Now that the crate was in the correct place, we had to get on with unloading its contents and transporting them up to our floor. The postdoc and I had to unload by hand 1,000 pounds worth of detector components and transport them in batches of 20 to 30 pounds up to our lab. By the time this whole ordeal was over, we'd spent nearly 5 hours of the day doing hard labor. Don't tell our boss, but at this point, we'd both decided that we'd had enough work for a day and quietly left, clocking out well before we were supposed to. The next day, I came in and sat down at my desk to start working on my simulations. Within 10 minutes, however, I was approached by my boss, who reminded me that I was supposed to be building the detector and that he'd be showing me how to do it. After going into the clean room, my boss sat down, collected a couple of components, and built part of the detector in about 2 to 3 minutes. I'm not at liberty to say what exactly he did due to the nature of my work, but it's best described as arts and crafts with PPE. When he was done, he turned around to me and said, "I'm going to need about 1,600 of these." Thinking that I'd huffed one too many computer duster cans the previous night, I asked him to clarify again just how many he wanted, and he repeated, 1,600 of them. I ended up sitting in that 80-degree Fahrenheit clean room for 12 days, 8 hours a day, doing arts and crafts for the DoD. There's definitely a joke to be made here about Marines eating crayons, but I'll leave that for people who actually served. One of my friends who saw me working in the room eventually commented that I was working in a sweatshop before guffawing and walking off. I thought about giving him a piece of my mind, but then I realized that I wouldn't be able to make my quota for the day if I did that, and gave up on it. But fate works in mysterious ways, and lo and behold, the next day, the boss threw him into the pen with me and told him to start working. Eventually, I managed to finish building all the necessary components and happily returned to my desk, thinking that I was done with the detector for good. Instead, my boss walked into my room, congratulated me on finishing building the detector, and then asked when I was going to get around to testing it. I was introduced to my new work environment, an RF cage located in the dark, sweaty armpit of the lab. For those of you who aren't familiar, an RF cage, also known as a Faraday cage, is essentially a big box of really fine chicken wire meant to stop electromagnetic radiation from going in or out. In my lab, the cage was installed to stop external radio signals from messing with stuff inside of the cage, hence why it's called a radio frequency cage, or RF cage. If you've ever had an MRI before, though, the walls of the room where the MRI machine is kept are lined in a similar material, except this time it's to stop the magnetic fields from the MRI machine from going outside of the room and messing around with the electronics. In pretty much every hospital, however, the shielding is built into the walls, behind the plaster, so you don't really see anything. Research labs don't care about appearances, though, so in my case, I was very literally in a copper wire cage. I felt like some sort of exotic animal when the boss closed the door on me and told me, in a voice that I couldn't help but think was just the tiniest bit mocking, "Good luck!" Testing the components involved taking 1,000 odd measurements, each of which individually took only on the order of 2 minutes. Unfortunately, due to the old age of the testing electronics and the nature of the experiments I was running, I had to monitor the testing rig at all times and manually initiate each of the 1,000 runs. What's more, I wasn't allowed to bring any electronics into the cage due to the sensitivity of the testing we were doing. I think you actually could have taken a well-trained monkey and had them do the exact same thing that I was doing, but the lab would never have done this because unlike interns, animals actually have some rights. Just kidding. By the end of the 4 straight days of testing, I felt as if a part of my soul had been trapped in that RF cage forever. I would see images of the electronics blinking on my drive back home if I zoned out for too long. In fact, for days afterwards, I remember that when I was sitting idle, my hands would involuntarily start going through the motions of starting yet another test run. With all of the building and testing finally finished, we shipped the detectors off to their final destination. A couple of weeks later, I heard from my boss that the people who had commissioned the detector were very happy with its performance, and that my detector had actually beaten all of the other detectors in most of the categories that mattered. I wasn't even aware that my thing was going to be entered as part of a contract competition, but I was glad to hear that my detector had found good use. Naturally, I asked him what they were doing with the detector now. "Oh, it's in storage somewhere. They said they'll pull it out when they actually need it. Who knows when that'll be. Anyways, I'm going to lunch. Good work again, Jeff."